When it comes to collecting, I have a weakness for the weird. Especially when it comes to controllers. The more strange and obtuse the design, the more I have to have it. Knowing that, you can probably understand why I was drawn to the FPS Master Controller, made by Radica in 2003. It certainly fits the definition of weird in my book. From the pistol grip-like handles to the grungy sci-fi texture work on its body, this is an interesting controller. As weird as it is, there's one question we have to ask ourselves when dealing with these weird and obscure controllers. What does it feel like to play with? Over the course of this video, we will most certainly answer this question, but first, I think it's important we have a quick history lesson on the company that made this controller, so we can better understand and appreciate where it's coming from. The company Radica was founded in 1983 and began their life creating electronic souvenir games for casinos. At some point during the 90s, they would decide to branch out into making small handheld electronic games. Some of these games include Rush Hour Traffic Jam from 2001, a classic game about getting your car out of a maze of traffic. Sub Assault from 1997, a submarine game about shooting down enemy ships. It features a really cool periscope design that you can put up to your face. A bunch of different type of card games, including Texas Hold'em, Solitaire, you name it. They even made a Tetris handheld in 2000. They would also go on to make a series of Sega Genesis plug-and-plays in 2003. From what I've read, these seem to suffer from poor sound emulation. But most successful of all was Bass Fishin. This came out in 1996, and this is probably what they're best known for. Bass Fishin would include motion controls for casting out your line, and a working crank handle you would use to reel in your fish. It was around the early 2000s that Radica thought that they would try something new. At some point around this time, they would create the Gamester brand and enter the third-party controller market. They would bring all their weird and interesting designs from their handheld electronics over to their controllers. Some of the other controllers from the Gamester line would include the Gamester Lotus Pro Driving Controller, with its driving wheel-like design in a small controller format, to their Evolution controller, creating what would essentially be the Power Glove of the PlayStation 2. Which brings us to the FPS Master, originally created in 2003 for the Xbox and PlayStation 2. Right off the bat, you can see the Radica influence in its design. There is no mistaking this for any other controller. It appears to be designed from the ground up to make any kid from the early 2000s go, "Oh sick, it's like I'm dual-wielding two guns while I play my favorite game." One of the most striking design features of this whole package are the pistol grips. This thing looks like a gun, from the rubberized pads on the handles to the triggers themselves, and yes, for some reason, it has trigger guards. One of the next things you'll probably notice is the lack of face buttons. At first glance, it seems to be missing a few buttons, namely the X and triangle button. What's interesting here are these are actually built in as paddle buttons on the handles. You can see on the handles we have X, L2, R2, and triangle. This is definitely an early example of this type of button layout, as I'm not familiar with any other earlier controller to do this. This is surprisingly relevant, as paddle buttons are having a sort of revival with the Xbox Elite and Valve's Steam controller, to name a few. One thing I want to mention at this point, and while I don't have any direct confirmation from the company itself, I believe the Xbox version was made before the PS2 version. Comparing the button layout between the Xbox and the PlayStation 2 versions, it seems the Xbox version makes a lot more sense. In that version, all the face buttons are represented as paddle buttons, and the two face buttons underneath the analog sticks are the black and white buttons. On top of all that, the PlayStation 2 version still has a space at the back for an Xbox memory card unit, an obvious reuse of the molds. We have two analog sticks situated at comfortable heights, each with decent travel and good L3 and R3 buttons. Under that, we have the other face buttons, square and circle, as well as select and start. Of course, we have the infamous triggers, and they default to L1 and R1. If you're confused as to why I said defaults to, well, that's because I've left my most favorite feature to last. You might have noticed this little LCD screen right in the middle of the unit. This controller has full, inbuilt custom mapping support. It also has the ability to invert the sticks on the actual controller itself. as well as save your custom mappings as presets using one of the 3 P buttons next to the LCD screen. What's cool as well is all the power that this controller needs is drawn straight from the console itself, so there's no dealing with external batteries or anything like that. This is pretty cool stuff if you ask me. I was super impressed that I was able to go through and rebind every button on this controller without ever having to look up a manual. So those are the ins and outs of the controller, but we still haven't answered that crucial question. How does it play? Alright, let's play some games. For my playtests, I've chosen 3 games, which I hope will encompass the both strengths and weaknesses of this controller. The first game I've chosen is Halo 2. From the forum posts I've read, this seems like the go-to game for this controller. I also think this will be a good test for a game with a lot of inputs and a lot of things going on. It's also an FPS, which is in the title of the controller. I think it's fitting that we do an FPS for an FPS controller. Also, in case you're wondering, I'll be using the PC version of Halo 2, using a USB to PS2 connector for my controller. I've rebound the controls so they match what the Xbox version would be, so I'll be using the straight up default configuration for this. The next game will be Burnout 3. I've chosen this for a couple of reasons. One, the default configuration of this controller doesn't really lend itself to racing games, so it'll be a good test of how the rebinding can make other games that would not be playable. 2, I've personally played this game a decent amount, so I know what to look for when comparing this controller to, say, a normal controller that I would normally play this game with. And 3, it's just a damn good game. Last but certainly not least, we'll be checking out Tetris. This game is on this list solely to test the D-pad, nothing else. This is definitely one game I need a good D-pad to play, and if the D-pad isn't good, I'll know pretty quickly. Not surprising, this controller works best with FPS games. The upside to having all these face buttons under your grips is that you never have to take your thumbs off the analog sticks, which, in an FPS, could mean a momentary pause in aiming as you go to press the jump button or reload button. One of the downsides to this, though, is that the button placements for these paddles means you'll be squeezing your hand and using fingers you don't normally use when using a normal controller. For short rounds of gaming, this should be fine, but for my extended time playing Halo 2, I found fatigue starting to set in on my middle fingers specifically, having to constantly squeeze my hand to reload, jump, and melee. It's something that prolonged use would probably fix, but it's something that I ran into. While we're on the subject of buttons, I have to say these buttons feel really good. One thing that's really great about this controller, and something I can't overstate enough, is how it feels to dual wield in a game like this. When you have 2 guns in the game and that syncs across to real life, it feels really good. Dual wielding magnums and pulling the triggers in an offset rhythm just feels amazing. Another thing to note here is really how big this controller is. I unfortunately have kind of small hands and found myself having to stretch a little further than I'm used to use the analog sticks. People with larger hands will probably find this controller a perfect fit, the same way the Duke found an audience with people with larger hands. Overall, my time with Halo 2 with this controller was fantastic. Of course, at the start there was a small teething stage, but after that, I kind of fell back into my groove. I was just playing Halo 2 again. I was even doing things I couldn't do before, like whipping around really quickly and swapping weapons at the same time, something that would normally have me taking my thumb off the analog stick to do. What's great about games like Burnout 3 is that for the majority of the gameplay, you don't really need a lot of buttons. You need accelerate, you need brake, you need boost, and you need review mirror. That's really it. This means you can easily bind buttons into an easy-to-reach way, and you don't really have to relearn anything. Unfortunately, the feeling of having the accelerator on the trigger doesn't quite have the same feeling as a gun in Halo 2, but it definitely feels better than a standard button. Overall, I thought the analog sticks performed very well here. I don't really have any major complaints with this game. I think arcade racing games would work great on this controller as well. Another note here is I also made heavy use of the programmable keys next to the LCD screen here. I had one configuration for Halo 2, and another configuration for Burnout 3. When it was time to record gameplay for one of these games, I would just switch to the configuration I had made earlier. Now let's look at the worst example. This was mainly to test the D-pad, and unfortunately it isn't the best. It certainly works. And for first-person games where the most you'll be doing is selecting a weapon or navigating a menu, it'll be perfect. For something that needs precision like Tetris, I found myself accidentally pressing up and dropping blocks all the time. For some reason, this D-pad requires a lot of pressure to press down on. The feedback on each press was less than ideal as well. The term spongy comes to mind, but it's kind of like a hard sponge. But yeah, overall, not the best D-pad, but for most games, it'll suffice. The FPS Master might not be a cornerstone in the evolution of controllers or bring anything amazing or new to the table, but it's a neat little thing, and I enjoyed my time with it. I'm making this video not as a review or anything like that. My hope is that by making a video like this, describing how it feels to play with this controller and giving a bit of history on the background of it, I can help preserve a little bit of gaming history.